Well, campaigners are warning that 9 out of 10 people in poorer countries are set to miss out on COVID-19 vaccines for next year. Several countries around the world are now receiving their vaccines for the first time. In Britain, people are being injected with a vaccine to protect them from the disease. But it could still be a long time before we receive the virus. It appears there's now a process of what's being called vaccine nationalism underway. Fatima Hasan is a human rights lawyer who's been looking at this issue. She joins us now. Fatima, good afternoon to you. I need to start with this question. What is vaccine nationalism?
Hi, Stephen. So vaccine nationalism is basically when wealthier countries with a lot of money and resources decide to buy up millions of dosages of vaccines for their country's citizens first and refuse to share them with citizens or people who need it and who are most at risk in other parts of the world. So it's also another way of basically describing hoarding.
So, I mean, it's hoarding, and I mean, the richer countries can do this and the poorer countries cannot, right?
Yeah, so, the latest reports and, a number of advocacy groups have been saying this for the past few weeks, that wealthier countries have bought up 3 times more supplies than they actually need. They've also bought up multiple potential vaccine products because they're basically hedging their bets, because so far only one has been given approval for emergency use. So basically there are now limited supplies left for 2021 and 2022 for poorer countries and particularly for countries in the global south.
I mean, is there any way to stop this from happening? And I hate to say this, but if you're if you're a democratically elected leader of a rich country and you do not do everything you can, rightly or wrongly, to get the vaccine for the people who voted for you, your chances of losing the next election are probably pretty high.
Yeah, I mean, that's partly true. But, in the beginning of the pandemic, a number of these countries pledged towards what we call global solidarity. And everybody undertook that in this pandemic, which is basically unprecedented, that all resources would be put onto the table to make sure that the entire world would benefit from life-saving interventions, that the entire world and those who are greatest at risk would receive the vaccine first. And so the idea of the people's vaccine was born, which basically promises that the vaccine would go to everyone, everywhere who needs it. And so there are things that can be done. We can course correct. We can share the technology. We can ensure that companies don't hold on to their patent monopoly rights and actually allow other companies to manufacture generic versions. We can insist that the drug companies share the technology or transfer the technology, because in many cases, these drug companies in the last few months have actually benefited from public investment and public funding into that accelerated research. So, there's a waiver request that the South African and Indian government have been jointly leading at the WTO, which is actually going to be discussed tomorrow, which could basically allow countries to take advantage of the advances in science over the last few months. But rich countries have not just only bought up these vaccine dosages, they're also blocking those very efforts to try and make sure that intellectual property doesn't become one of the key barriers to why you and I will have to wait very long in this country for a vaccine dosage.
Does it help that there's more than one candidate vaccine? And what I mean by that is that there's a sort of slight element of competition. And the world has changed in a way. I mean, we've seen global brands badly damaged by their response or non-response to certain issues in society. So, I mean, if there are 2 vaccines for sale in the United States, for example, and one of those companies is accused of preventing that vaccine from being sold at an affordable price in Africa, that could actually have a consequence for that company. I mean, the power of public opinion has become really important. I suppose the problem is the vaccine is life-saving. People are desperate for it.
Yeah, and one would think that in a pandemic that companies would actually be deeply embarrassed at what they're doing, which in my view is quite unethical and quite immoral. One would think that in a pandemic of this nature, that wealthier countries who bought up more supplies than they needed of multiple products would also feel embarrassed, but that certainly isn't the case. And, it's what we talked about earlier. It's why we call it vaccine nationalism. So the issue really is what kind of pressure can government leaders in the global south put on a number of these countries, as well as the drug companies, and start asserting their sovereign rights. Because remember, it's not just about wealthy country re-election processes. We are also looking at our governments in the global south. How much will they do? What actions will they take? Which international law allows them to basically make sure that there is affordable and sustainable supplies of vaccines in our country. The tricky part in relation to the multiple vaccine research trials that are happening at such a fast pace, and as you know, there's over 200 vaccine candidates, over 40 are in different stages of quite advanced clinical inquiry and investigation, is that we really don't know which will be the top 5, which will be the top 3. So at the moment, a lot of governments are basically hedging their bets, are pursuing bilateral agreements to try and buy up as many pre-dosages as possible, and are also, putting a lot of money on the table in the COVAX initiative to try and negotiate for their citizens and for their regions first. So, the organizations like MSF have been saying companies have got to let go of their patent monopolies in this pandemic. We all have to work together to ask them to do that. They have to share their technology, we have to drop the prices, and we have to make sure that we can have as many supplies of multiple approved and registered for use vaccine products in our regions, because otherwise we are going to have a worse crisis at the end of 2021. We're going to be facing repeat lockdowns. We're going to have a worsening socioeconomic crisis. So, there's also a bottom line element to this. It would actually be in the interest of everybody if this technology is actually shared so that we could all have access to a vaccine quite soon.
Fatima, I'd like to suggest that as South Africa, we could actually find ourselves in 2 separate positions on this at different times. We might find ourselves at the beginning of vaccines being distributed on a wide basis, knocking on the doors of richer countries saying, oi, we need the formula, we need help, we need doses, we need to make sure that our health workers get inoculated, our people are at risk, and that we're at that side of the equation, whereas the United States has already, inoculated a high percentage of their population, and we're behind, knocking on the door to get in. And then in 6 months' time, we might find, because of our position on the continent of Africa and economically, that we're the ones being accused of vaccine nationalism. I mean, it seems strange, but we could actually find ourselves as South Africa in contradictory positions here at different times.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It's a tricky situation, and that's why the one thing that is quite reassuring is that the African Union is actually speaking with one voice, and they're talking about having an African-wide allocation and distribution plan. I think the problem that we're now dealing with is that there are so many different moving parts to the global vaccine agenda that it's very difficult for regions and for blocs to act as, consistently and with one voice. And that's why on an almost weekly basis, you see so many different developments which are so contradictory happening, for example, in Brazil. Yet at the same time, Brazil is opposing the waiver request of South Africa and India, and ironically, they're all part of BRICS, right? So, the US and the UK will say that they're committed to making sure that developing countries have access to vaccines, but only maybe for 20% of the population because they've pre-purchased most of the dosages for themselves. So, I think we're in a global moment of crisis. I think this vaccine nationalism has brought us to the point where we all have to course correct. Clearly, the existing bilateral agreements, COVAX, and many of the other initiatives that are being pursued for purely nationalistic purposes are actually not going to work, because the irony is you're going to have a whole lot of holiday makers coming from the UK who've been vaccinated into a country where none of us have been vaccinated. So, the entire global agenda of solidarity is severely at risk, is in peril. And I think that, it's not just wealthy countries that are to blame for this, but it's also these pharmaceutical companies that have the leading vaccine candidates in advanced stages of approval, where they are determining the supplies that will go to which country, they are determining how many, they are determining the price, and they are determining who they will give permission to manufacture generic versions. And that is not going to work in a pandemic like this. We've seen this with HIV/AIDS, and unfortunately we warned 5-6 months ago that we're going down the same road, and that's where we are. We're exactly at that point now.
Fatima Hasan, social justice activist, human rights lawyer, thank you very much indeed. Really do appreciate the time. Well,